you know, less, maybe a fraction of 1%, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and bike stuff is usually pretty cheap. Portland's entire network was made, they figured this out, for less than the cost of redoing one freeway interchange that they had to do. You know? I mean, they did essentially this 200-plus mile bike network for under $100 million. I mean, it's mostly paint on the road and, you know, little stuff. There are a few expensive pieces of it, but really, you know, you can do a lot. So there started to be a flow of federal money. In the 90s, the public health community started getting very concerned that we were having this obesity epidemic on our hands. You know, in the late 80s, early 90s, I think there was 1 or 2 states that had an adult obesity rate of over 20%. Now there's only 1 or 2 states that don't have an obesity rate over 20%. They started realizing that they couldn't just say to people, go exercise. You know, the Surgeon General says you need to exercise 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise 3 to 4 days a week or something like that. And people just, a large percentage of people simply weren't doing it, whether they didn't have the time, motivation, or whatever. And they started realizing that you need to integrate it in people's daily lives. It just needs to be a regular part of their life. In fact, if you go to a lot of the websites now, they talk, you know, like the Centers for Disease Control and stuff, they talk about physical activity. Exercise is a bad word, so we're trying to just say activity. People need to be active. And that, the whole term active transportation came on. So that was one thing. Then we get to sort of the turn of the century. Global warming, climate change started becoming something that was being discussed widely in the public. You know, all of a sudden we started realizing once again that we had to start thinking about reducing our dependence on fossil fuel and carbon. You know, think about, you know, the peak oil started to be a phrase that started to become in the lexicon, and gas prices started rising. Congestion and you know, congestion became a lot worse in the city. So I think all these factors led to an increased interest in cycling, and it's just been sort of fascinating to see this whole movement that in many ways is kind of grassroots driven. One thing about cyclists is they get very passionate. Unlike a lot of things in life, I mean, they really identify with it. They're willing to join organizations, get involved in lobbying. And a lot of people you might not think of, they cycle and it radicalizes them in a way, and they get very involved. I'll tell you one short little story. There's a guy in New York City named Mark Gorton who was a young banker. He's a software engineer, actually, but he did some sort of financial wizardry at Credit Suisse Bank in Midtown Manhattan 15-some years ago, and he used to ride his bike to work. You know, he was one of these geeky engineers, and he thought, well, you know, it's only 2 or 3 miles. This is a logical way to get to work. You know, it's very fast. It's faster. I've timed it out. It's faster than subway, cab, you know, car. It's cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. And it used to really piss him off that he felt like he was taking his life in his hands doing it. And the guy made, to make a long story short, made a lot of money and started planning. You know, first he became the biggest donor to Transportation Alternatives, which is a big bike, transit, pedestrian lobby in New York. Then he decided that wasn't enough, and he started his own nonprofit. And one of the things they did, you may have seen this site, Streets Blog. They do streets films, and you know, he's hired an entire staff of writers and videographers and photographers to sort of document what he calls the livable streets movement. And one of the fascinating things, they started looking at the IP addresses of who was reading their website, and it was all these bureaucrats at the New York City Department of Transportation. So they realized they had their ear, you know, and they were sort of lobbying and writing about all this stuff. I mean, people didn't pay much attention to the interior workings of the Department of Transportation. And lo and behold, the mayor hired this new transportation commissioner, Jeanette Sadek-Khan, who was very plugged in to this whole idea that, you know, most people in New York City don't even own a car, so let's start reorienting how we use the public space. Hired a bunch of people, some from Transportation Alternatives and other groups, and all of a sudden stuff that Streets Blog was writing about as fantasy started to become reality. I remember talking to Mark Gorton 2 years ago, and he said, my dream is to close Broadway. And I said, yeah, right. And has anybody read The Ruse? Yeah. Well, I heard it 2 years ago, and I thought the guy was an idiot. So it just, you know, it just shows, once again, I mean, this, and, you know, it all started from the seat of a bicycle. I don't want to ramble on too long here because I want to save some time for questions. I want to read 2 short passages out of the book that I think give you a feel for it. And also, you know, I thought about, okay, what do I want to read to a group like this? And one thing that I do want to read is because, you know, you're in LA and it's kind of tough and you got to work a little harder here. I wanted to sort of just, you know, show you how things can be a little different somewhere else. So this is called Learning from Amsterdam, and I think you'll get why I'm reading from this. Roger Geller's eyes danced with pleasure as he intently watched the street scene along the Amstel River on an unseasonably warm and sunny day in Amsterdam in late fall. An elderly couple leisurely pedaled in unison along a lane of cobblestones and casually turned left onto a busy bridge that leads over the river. Another couple, with a toddler nestled on a small seat in front of the handlebars on the dad's bike, rattled by and slowed for just a moment at the intersection before forging onward. Moments later, a young woman rode over the bridge, carefully balancing a wrapped package of food flat in one hand. An eye-catching red Ferrari convertible rumbled down the lane. The couple inside happily chattered as they meandered along, not going much faster than the bikes around them. A tram whooshed over the bridge as cyclists streamed around the vehicle. Look how close everybody comes and nobody seems to mind, said Geller as we sat at an outdoor cafe table. It's a complicated dance and everybody knows the steps. It is also, for people like Geller, Portland's bicycle coordinator, almost a religious affirmation. Back home, even in a relatively bike-friendly city like Portland, it's hard to stay true to your vision. The vast majority climbs into their cars for almost every trip, and they can't imagine it ever being any different. After a while, if you're a bike advocate, it can wear you down. But in the Netherlands, you can restore your faith. No Western country, with the possible exception of Denmark, has a cycling culture so rich, so nurtured by government, and so seemingly enduring. Fly to Schiphol Airport, jump on a train to central Amsterdam, and you will be in the middle of a city of 750,000, where on any given day, half the population is out on a bike. Think about that one. Ever since I started hanging around bike folks, I had wanted to experience Dutch cycling. I lost count of the number of bike advocates who told me about their life-changing trip to Amsterdam or other bike legendary cities in Holland like Delft or Groningen. So I jumped at the chance to spend a week in the Netherlands with a group of bike advocates and city officials from Portland. I arrived in Amsterdam early on a Sunday morning, emerging from Central Station to see one lone bicyclist on an otherwise deserted street. A fellow wearing leather chaps but no pants. Just a working stiff from the red light district heading home, I guessed. I dumped my luggage at my hotel, where I was also able to rent one of the small fleet of bikes they kept on hand for guests. Like that, that's a cool thing. I rode around by myself for a while, trying to gain a sense of how to navigate the separated bikeways that snake along next to roads, through parks, and sometimes down the middle of a sidewalk. Later I met Geller and we set off on a tour of the city, guided a map from a web page set up to show off Amsterdam's bikeways. As the streets began to fill with more traffic, we realized that one of our toughest challenges was being assertive about taking the right of way. You will hardly find a stop sign in Amsterdam, indeed in the whole country, and we learned to watch the shark's teeth found at almost every intersection. If the teeth of the white painted triangles are pointed at you, yield to oncoming traffic. If they're in the opposite direction, you have the right of way and you're expected to take it. That's where the dance comes in. Falter because you don't trust the other cyclists and drivers, and everyone gets annoyed, at least mildly so. If you're the kind of cyclist used to riding in American cities, it doesn't take long for Amsterdam's bike magic to wash over you. Here you feel like part of the majority, not the oddball. Like most everyone else, we rode heavy, one-speed bikes that discouraged us from setting a torrid pace. And in fact, we didn't feel much need to rush. We didn't worry about sprinting past potentially dangerous traffic situations because there usually weren't any. When you were sharing a street with cars, generally on low-speed neighborhood streets, you were not wondering when to take the lane or when to stay to the side. That's simple in Amsterdam. If you're in front of a car, you can just stay in